An ordinary trip to the grocery store turned into an unforgettable showdown when an elderly woman told a young black man to go back to Africa. What he said next didn't just silence the room, it changed everything. The grocery store was bustling with activity. Shoppers pushed their carts down the aisles, some lost in thought while others chatted quietly. It was a sunny afternoon in a small Ohio neighborhood where everyone seemed to know everyone. But today, the usual rhythm of daily life would break in the most unexpected way. Near the produce section, an elderly woman, probably in her late 70s, stood adjusting her glasses. She muttered under her breath as she reached for a bag of apples. Her faded cardigan and carefully pinned silver hair gave her an unassuming look, but what she said next was anything but ordinary. Nearby, a young black man named Daryl, casually dressed in a blue hoodie and jeans, reached for a bag of oranges. He was calm, polite, and blended easily into the flow of the store. Balancing a basket of groceries in one hand and texting on his phone with the other, he seemed like any other shopper. But then, the elderly woman turned sharply toward him. Her expression shifted, her eyes narrowed, and her lips pursed tightly. "You people don't belong here," she said loudly, making sure others could hear. Daryl froze, his fingers hovering over his phone. He looked up, his face a mix of shock and confusion. She didn't stop. Her tone grew sharper and more cutting. "Why don't you go back to Africa where you came from?" The air in the store thickened. A few shoppers stopped in their tracks, exchanging uneasy glances. Others pretended not to hear, but the hum of the store faded into an awkward silence. Daryl's first reaction was shock. His brow furrowed, and for a moment, it seemed like he might say something immediately. But he didn't. Instead, he took a slow breath, his face unreadable as though carefully considering every possible response. The elderly woman stood her ground, clutching her apples with defiance. The tension in the air was palpable. A young mother steered her child away quickly, while an older man near the potatoes glanced nervously at Daryl, waiting to see what he would do. For a moment, Daryl didn't move. His hand tightened on the basket's handle as the world seemed to shrink around him. The weight of the woman's words hung in the air like a bad smell no one could escape. Finally, Daryl straightened his posture, setting his basket down on the floor with deliberate care. He fixed his gaze on the woman, calm but firm. When he spoke, his voice was low yet steady, cutting through the silence like a knife. "Ma'am," he said, his tone measured, "do you even realize what you just said?" The question wasn't angry or accusatory, it was reflective, almost like he was giving her a chance to reconsider. But she didn't. "I said what I said," she snapped, her voice rising. "This is my country. People like you don't belong here." A woman near the bread section gasped, and the quiet murmur of the crowd grew louder. Still, Daryl remained steady. He didn't yell. He didn't step closer. Instead, he let the silence linger, allowing her words to sink into the ears of everyone present. "All right," he said finally, nodding slowly. His calmness was unsettling in its strength. "Let's talk about that, since you brought it up." The room held its breath, every eye on Daryl. His voice, when it came, was even but powerful, each word chosen with care. "You said I don't belong here," he began, "but let me tell you something about where I come from." He paused, his gaze steady on her. "My great-great-grandfather was born in Mississippi," he said. "He was a sharecropper, breaking his back on land he didn't own so his kids might have a better life." "His father?" "He was a slave who kidnapped, beaten, sold like property, to build the very country you're standing in." The elderly woman's lips tightened, but she didn't interrupt. Around them, the crowd was transfixed. A man near the dairy section lowered his phone, and an older couple whispered to each other but didn't look away. "My grandfather," Daryl continued, his voice growing stronger, "fought in World War II. He risked his life for a country that treated him like dirt when he came back. He couldn't sit at the same counters or drink from the same fountains as others. But he stayed. Do you know why? Because he believed in this country's promise, even when it didn't believe in him." The hum of the refrigerators seemed to fade into the background. The room was utterly silent. My parents, Daryl went on, his tone soft but firm, fought too, not with guns or fists, but by working hard every single day. My mother's a teacher. She spent her life helping kids, no matter what they look like. My father's a mechanic, the kind of man who'd stop to help someone like you if your car broke down. He let the words hang in the air before continuing. So, you're telling me I don't belong here? That I should go back to Africa? He shook his head, his voice tinged with sadness now. Ma'am, I am as much a part of this country as you are. Maybe even more, because my family paid the price for it in blood, sweat, and tears. The woman's face flushed, her hands trembling as she clutched her apples. She opened her mouth to speak but stopped, her words catching in her throat. Daryl stepped back, his composure unshaken. I could have walked away, he said, addressing the crowd now. But what good would that do? Ignorance doesn't get better in silence. It's up to all of us to be better, better than this, better than words like those. His words lingered in the air, heavy with truth. The store was silent, but the story wasn't over yet. The crowd's reaction spoke louder than words. The silence after Daryl's statement was almost deafening. For a moment, no one moved. The elderly woman's face was a mix of emotions, anger, embarrassment, and something deeper. It looked almost like shame. She glanced around the room, as if searching for someone to back her up, but no one did. A middle-aged man wearing a baseball cap stepped forward. He's right, the man said, his voice breaking the stillness. We've got to be better than this. His words broke the spell. An older woman near the frozen foods nodded, her eyes misty. My dad fought in that same war, she said softly, her voice trembling. He always told me the only color that mattered was the red on the flag. The murmurs began to grow. A young cashier, no older than 20, called out from her station. I've never seen anyone handle something like that so gracefully. Thank you. The elderly woman, now visibly flustered, clutched her cart tightly. She didn't apologize, but the fire in her eyes had dimmed. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, almost hesitant. I didn't mean, she started, but her words trailed off. Daryl turned back to her, his expression softer now. It's not about what you meant, he said gently. It's about how it came across. Words matter. Actions matter even more. From the deli counter, a man started clapping. The applause was hesitant at first, but it quickly grew. Soon, the entire store joined in, the sound swelling and filling the space. The claps weren't just for Daryl's words, they were for his courage, his calm, and his dignity. The elderly woman looked around one last time, her face pale and uncertain. Without another word, she wheeled her cart toward the exit. As she walked away, a few people moved to comfort Daryl. One woman placed a hand on his shoulder and said softly, "Thank you for saying what needed to be said." Daryl smiled faintly and picked up his basket. Sometimes, he said, almost to himself, it's not about winning or losing. It's about making sure people hear the truth. The crowd began to disperse, the tension in the air replaced by quiet reflection. Some people looked inspired, others deep in thought, but everyone seemed changed in some way. The moment had passed, but the impact of Daryl's words lingered. As shoppers returned to their routines, the grocery store felt different. It was quieter, more thoughtful. Daryl finished his shopping, his steps calm and steady, as if processing everything that had happened. The weight of the moment hadn't shaken him, but it had left him reflective. At the checkout, the young cashier who had spoken earlier scanned his items with a shy smile. What you said back there, she hesitated, then continued, it meant a lot. People don't always stand up like that, especially with so much grace. Daryl smiled back, his tone warm. Sometimes grace is the only way to break through. Anger just builds walls. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the parking lot. As Daryl walked to his car, he noticed the elderly woman sitting in hers, gripping the steering wheel tightly. For a moment, he considered walking over to her, but he decided against it. Some lessons take time to settle. He had already said what needed to be said. Later that evening, Daryl sat at the kitchen table with his father, recounting the day's events. His father, a man of few words, listened quietly, his hands folded on the table. When Daryl finished, his father nodded slowly. "You did the right thing, son," he said finally. "Not just for yourself, but for everyone who was watching. People like her, they might not change overnight. But you planted a seed. And sometimes, that's all you can do. Plant the seed, and let it grow." Daryl nodded, his father's words resonating deeply. The encounter at the grocery store had been uncomfortable, but it had also been necessary. Ignorance doesn't change unless it's confronted, and silence only allows it to grow unchecked. Across town, the elderly woman sat at her dining table, staring at the untouched plate of food before her. Daryl's words played on repeat in her mind, each one cutting through the armor of her assumptions. She thought of her own grandchildren and the world they were growing up in. For the first time in years, she felt a pang of something unfamiliar, doubt. In the days that followed, the story of what had happened at the grocery store spread through the neighborhood. People spoke of Daryl's response, his courage, and the dignity with which he had handled the situation. The incident became more than just a moment, it became a lesson. A reminder of the power of words and the importance of standing up for what is right. Daryl didn't seek attention for what he had done, but his actions rippled through the community in ways he hadn't expected. Strangers approached him, thanking him and sharing their own stories of prejudice and resilience. His quiet stand had sparked conversations that had been avoided for far too long. The elderly woman began to change as well. It wasn't immediate, but she started questioning the beliefs she had clung to for so many years. She didn't know if she would ever see Daryl again, but if she did, she hoped she'd have the courage to apologize. Moments like these remind us of the power of kindness, strength, and truth in the face of ignorance. They teach us that standing up doesn't always mean shouting, it can mean speaking calmly, with conviction, and letting the truth do the rest. To everyone watching, let this story be a reminder, your words and actions matter. They can hurt or heal, divide or unite. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Together, we can spread messages of hope, courage, and understanding to create a better world.